is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
In a recent visit to Nairobi, Zimbabwean President Emmerson Mnangagwa discussed a wide range of bilateral issues with his Kenyan counterpart, Uhuru Kenyatta. Central to the visit, though, was Mnangagwa's petition for Kenyatta's help in Harare's battle against unilateral Western sanctions imposed in 2002 and scaled up in 2003. Zimbabwe says the sanctions have destroyed the livelihoods of its citizens and wants the embargo lifted. But are sanctions to blame for Zimbabwe's economic woes? This week on the program, we find out why they were imposed and their impact on the country. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Targeting leaders and selected institutions, the two-decade-long embargo has ended up hurting ordinary Zimbabweans more. The measures include a freeze on assets of individuals, visa bans, cessation of defense cooperation, and suspension of government-to-government assistance. They were imposed during the reign of President Robert Mugabe. CGTN's Farai Mwakutuya has more.
Zimbabwe was slapped with sanctions by the European Union and the United States after it implemented a fast-track land reform program in the early 2000s. Though the measures have been progressively eased, the damage wrought over 2 decades has been immense.
We have not received any significant investment over the last, 10, 15 years, simply because Zimbabwe is seen as a risky destination given that there are sanctions. A lot of banks are no longer dealing with us. So the issue of transactional activity is actually stifled and business transactions are limited because you are labeled as a country under sanctions, and that obviously affects the business in the country. So it hurts the economy.
A United Nations rapporteur who visited the country last October gave a harsh assessment of the social impact of the sanctions.
Impeding Zimbabwe's achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals and undermining the right to development of the people of Zimbabwe.
Analysts believe the restrictive measures have failed to punish the intended targets to the detriment of ordinary citizens.
The elite in these countries have got a lot of money, and they've got money offshore, they've got money elsewhere. Any particular sanctions allows them to actually have alternatives, whereas individuals who are in a particular country under sanctions and are suffering because of those particular sanctions have no option.
Almost all facets of life have been impacted.
There are few jobs. Crime has increased as people look for ways to survive. The quality of our children's education has suffered. We've experienced shortages of basic commodities and our industrial base shrunk.
For some, the measures are necessary.
The economy is suffering in Zimbabwe because our politics is so toxic. Sanctions are coming in to level the playing field and to make politicians to account for their actions.
The government says it has implemented reforms to open up democratic space and continues to engage the West to normalize relations. Zimbabwe has recently been emboldened and may feel vindicated in its fight against the sanctions after member states of the Southern African Development Community declared October 25th as the day on which all countries in the region will stand with Zimbabwe in calling for the immediate and unconditional removal of the measures. Farai Mwakutuya, CGTN, Harare, Zimbabwe.
Well, Zimbabwe's economy has been in free fall now for over 2 decades. Before we begin our discussions with my panel today, let's hear something from the Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs and International Trade from Zimbabwe. He's the Honorable Musabayana David. Honorable Deputy Minister, thank you very much for joining us on Talk Africa today. I want first to start off by looking at the impact of sanctions on Zimbabwe. What is your view on the sanctions, and is there still justification for the continuation of the sanctions?
Beatrice, Zimbabwe has been under illegal and unfair economic sanctions for close to a quarter of a century now. These sanctions are illegal because they were not sanctions. They were not approved by the United Nations. And these sanctions were imposed using a wrong and wrongful basis because Zimbabwe had reclaimed its land, which was part of the Lancaster House Agreement of the 21st of December 1979, and where United States of America and the United Kingdom agreed and offered as the guarantors to this conference that they will compensate the farmers who had illegally taken away land from the indigenous Zimbabweans. So Zimbabwe was penalized for implementing what was agreed because the United States of America and Britain reneged from that agreement. Up to today, they have never compensated a single cent. Now, fast forward. These sanctions have been claimed to be targeted and having not impacting on the general civic society of Zimbabwe.
Honorable Deputy Minister, you know, the sanctions you've talked about go back to 2001, and they were imposed under the leadership of the late President Mugabe. There has been a change of leadership since then, but the sanctions have not been lifted. Why haven't the sanctions been removed?
Now that these sanctions were imposed on a certain dispensation, and that dispensation has since been removed, and we have a new leadership under the President Dr. Mnangagwa, who has come up with a slew of reforms. And these reforms, we expected were going to aid in the removal of sanctions, and indeed, with the EU, we've made some progress, where most of the people have now been, all the people have now been from the sanctions. We've started trading and doing business with the EU. But with the United States of America, they still renewed the sanctions a few weeks ago, where they are saying they are renewing the data for another 12 months. This is confusing because in terms of electoral reforms, they've been put in place. Space has been opened up for the opposition parties. We have also realized that a lot does happen on our social media, on Twitter and whatever. People say whatever they want with government or against certain government officials, right, even the head of state. But we've seen democracy prevailing, but still sanctions are still renewed by United States of America. So they keep on shifting goalposts and also changing the terms of reference when it comes to the renewal of these economic sanctions.
So a very final question to you, Honorable Deputy Minister. You know, there are two arguments of thought regarding the sanctions against Zimbabwe. One side says that, you know, it is really part of the government's mismanagement and corruption that is causing the economic meltdown in Zimbabwe. You know, are the sanctions really to blame, or is it mismanagement and corruption from your government?
We don't have mismanagement of the economy. Why? Because I've highlighted that we had a twin deficit, where we had a fiscal deficit and a trade deficit. But all the deficits have been reversed. In terms of the budget, we are now operating on a surplus, where we only eat what we have killed, although people have been disputing that because of lack of understanding. But it just goes to show that government is not over borrowing. in terms of the trade deficit, we have reduced it from 1.6 billion to less than 500 million. That's tremendous stride under conditions of economic sanctions, under conditions where almost every 2 years we have had drought. We have also been just coming out of Cyclone Idai, where we deployed a lot of resources towards it. So we are saying we don't have credit lines, we don't have any grants that were being given by the international community. But over and above that, we have scored an economic growth that was underpinned or affirmed by the World Bank of 7.8%. And they themselves said this was the biggest growth in Africa. So where does mismanagement come from? You can't say you are mismanaging an economy and that economy is registering economic growth. A symptom of a mismanaged economy is a ballooning budget deficit, a ballooning trade deficit, hyperinflation. I've said from 2018 to now, inflation has fallen from 800% to around 60%. That's good management of the economy. In terms of corruption, we've seen government ministers, more than 4 ministers, losing their cabinet position. It has never happened. It has not happened in many countries in the world where a president fired the people that he would have appointed because of corruption. We have also seen government officials being dismissed for misdemeanors or corruption. That is a good sign that economy is more managed and we are dealing with corruption. As you know, corruption is a cancer that has affected the whole world, but we have made tremendous strides under the leadership of President Dr. Mnangagwa.
Thank you so much for joining us on the program, the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Trade from Zimbabwe. And on that note, let's take a short break. And when we come back, we'll be joined by our panel and we'll look into why the sanctions have not been removed and what it would take to lift Zimbabwe out of its economic crisis. Stay with us. Well, let's now bring in our panel, all joining via Zoom. Joining me from Polokwane, Professor Ricky Mukonza, Senior Lecturer in Politics and Public Affairs, Tshwane University. And in Johannesburg, Rutendo Matinyarare, Marketing Strategist and Anti-Sanctions Campaigner. A warm welcome to you both to the program. Let me start off with you, Professor Mukonza. Looking at those sanctions imposed on Zimbabwe since way back in 2001, are those sanctions helping Zimbabweans at all?
I think by and large, sanctions that were imposed on Zimbabwe are not in any way helping Zimbabweans. If anything, they are giving the ruling elite an excuse for misgovernance. They are giving the ruling elite, cheap campaigning material. If you look at the material conditions, nothing really has changed for the people of Zimbabwe. If anything, things have gone worse. But why I further say sanctions are not working is that the so-called targeted people, those that are targeted with sanctions, are not affected in any way. They continue to live in their lavish ways. So by and large, I argue that the sanctions as an instrument to influence political behavior of the ruling elite in Zimbabwe have not worked.
Rutendo, what's your view here? Is there a justification of the continued imposition of these sanctions?
The Special Rapporteur of the UN Human Rights Council came to Zimbabwe and declared the sanctions upon Zimbabwe illegal. There are also a number of resolutions that include 44-215 and 34-13 that have said that unilateral sanctions imposed by nations upon other nations without the consultation of the UN and without the UN instituting those sanctions is illegal. So sanctions are not a tool to try and influence political behavior, because in 1989, they created a resolution that is called 44-215 that actually outlawed the use of coercive economic measures, especially upon third world countries that were former colonies, by Western countries to influence their political demeanor. So the UN felt that Western countries were utilizing the power that they accumulated from colonialism to actually continue to administer their former colonies by utilizing these coercive measures. So they're illegal. And they also are collective punishment of civilians, thus crimes against humanity by persecution. There is no way that a crime against humanity, such as persecution, can be used to bring any change that is positive. In fact, it is a form of illegal warfare, according to the Geneva Convention.
So what I'm hearing, what I'm hearing, Rutendo, though, is that the sanctions at this point against Zimbabwe are actually being used, as a tool, as a symbolic tool, not really to achieve the intended means. I mean, did the sanctions here then miss the target of what they were intended to do?
They are not missing the target of what they intended to do, because sanctions were imposed on Zimbabwe to give an advantage to the opposition members. They were targeted on the government of Zimbabwe, its institutions, its parastatals, to cripple that government from undertaking the delivery of services and the development of the country, so that the Zimbabwean people would be frustrated and then vote for the opposition political parties. So it's a form of terrorism, if not a form of persecution or punishment of civilians to force them to vote for the opposition. And in that way, it has actually helped the opposition to manage all our urban municipalities, which we believe is a contravention of international law. It is a contravention of human rights when a political party can use coercive economic measures and persecution to force people to vote for it.
Professor Mukonza, Mukonza, is that your thoughts as well? Like, this has actually given the opposition an edge, and it was supposed to give to make some sort of regime change in Zimbabwe at the time.
Sanctions were meant to, influence certain political behavior that started developing in Zimbabwe. You would recall that around 2000, probably others would even link the sanctions to the land reform, but I more specifically want to talk of the political developments that we saw around 2000 with the elections that took place around that time. We saw the violence that ensued. We saw the alleged. We also heard of the alleged unfair electoral practices that were, giving an advantage to the ruling party.
Right.
We saw a lot of things that, were not only, a problem to outsiders, but were also a problem to Zimbabweans themselves.
So
a very good section of Zimbabweans themselves. So sanctions, in my opinion, came in to try and correct that behavior. To say, those that are at the helm, or those that are, are pushing or are seen as leading this, this violence, this vote rigging, and so forth, need to change their political behavior. This is where I came in and said the sanctions were meant to correct certain political behavior.
Did it change that behavior, though? Did it correct that political behavior?
Unfortunately, they did not. We must admit that that behavior still continues. We know that just recent at a rally in Kwekwe for the opposition political party, the coalition, Citizen Coalition for Change, we saw the violence that ensued there, and we also know of the alleged vote rigging that took place in the 2018 election, general elections. So by and large, it hasn't really influenced the political elite to change as was desired.
Let me hear Rutendo's view here. If it hasn't motivated the political elite to change their behavior, so then why are the ordinary Zimbabweans then left to suffer? Because, you know, it is now said that today, half of Zimbabwe's 13.5 million people are living below the poverty line as a result of sanctions and other factors.
I think the claim to say that sanctions were imposed to change behavior is disingenuous. And it is disingenuous because we live in a nation and a world that confines itself to rule of law. And according to rule of law, the United States, the Europeans, and no individual country has the right to actually try and engineer or change the workings of a sovereign nation by utilizing means such as coercion, economic coercion, or warfare. So if there was a problem in Zimbabwe, there are mechanisms within the international sphere that could have been utilized, like the International Court of Justice, the Human Rights Council, to investigate these human rights violations and this so-called violence. None of that ever took place. And the question we ask is, why did people not approach the Human Rights Council of the UN to undertake an investigation of the claims of this election rigging, the claims of this human rights violation, instead of Western countries that used to be our colonizers, the ones that used to perpetrate crimes against humanity, undertaking their own mob justice upon Zimbabwe? And there's been no answer to that. The claim of electoral rigging can be tested in courts of law in Zimbabwe. The presidential elections were contested in 2018. There was a dispute, and it was taken to the Constitutional Court. The opposition lost because they could not prove vote rigging was taking place. So the reason why there's been no change is because the grounds upon which people are saying that sanctions were imposed are false. They are false. They are based on allegations that have never been tested in any court. They're based on allegations that have never been tried and evidence never been provided. And that's why there can be no change for any reason based on allegations that have brought about these sanctions.
Professor Mukonza, your thoughts here, because now that has been put to the test.
I also believe that while Rutendo has a right to disagree with me, but I think it is also disingenuous to deny evidence that is before us of electoral violence that has bedeviled Zimbabwe since 2000. Evidence of killings and maimings on the basis of political differences is something that can be, one can just do a simple internet search and find that information. Evidence is abound on those issues.
Rutendo, I mean, does Zimbabwe, though, if you go back to say these are some of the issues that can be tested in a court of law, does Zimbabwe have those institutions, or did Zimbabwe have those institutions to test the evidence that Professor Mukonza is talking about?
Zimbabwe is one of the countries with the least crime in the African continent because our legal system works, our law enforcement works. So the excuse of people utilizing allegations as fact is something that doesn't make sense, because the reason why courts exist, the reason why the word due process exists, is so that allegations can be tested in a court of law. And if courts of laws in Zimbabwe are not working, there are mechanisms within the UN, there are mechanisms within the UN Human Rights Council. We've got offices of the UN in Zimbabwe. If they felt that Zimbabwe was not following due process, its laws were not working, the country was dysfunctional, they would put in reports into the UN Human Rights Council. Right. We know that the United States itself has been taken to the UN Human Rights Council for crimes against humanity and war crimes, and they've been convicted within that particular forum. Right now, we've got the South African government being taken to the International Court of Justice because of the xenophobic violence taking place upon truck drivers in South Africa. But we have never seen the Zimbabwean government being taken to any multilateral forum or any other body to investigate its violations of human rights in Zimbabwe. And what we are saying to Zimbabweans, particularly the opposition, particularly analysts like the professor himself, is that we cannot decide to abrogate a due process when it comes to Zimbabwe just so that we can get and score easy political points.
Professor Mukonza, let me hear your view on this, though. So should the sanctions still remain, even though the initial targets seem not to be changing their ways and probably will not change their ways?
I don't see the necessity of sanctions being maintained. In any case, we have all seen. If anyone had doubted at the beginning, we have now seen that these sanctions are probably not the best instrument to influence change in political behavior among the ruling elites. If anything, I believe these sanctions are giving ZANU-PF an edge. They are giving ZANU-PF an advantage, because each time they go to elections and probably they have failed to do certain things, they blame it on sanctions. And for that reason, I'm convinced from where I'm standing that these sanctions are actually aiding ZANU-PF more than they are helping the people of Zimbabwe.
All right, Rutendo, what would it take, though, for Zimbabwe to move forward?
Well, first of all, the removal of sanctions is what will take for Zimbabwe to move forward. What the professor forgets is that we already have a precedence of the impact of crimes against humanity. So, and the Geneva Convention, which allows nations to go to war, sets rules for countries to fight each other, has actually said that sanctioning people or sanctioning countries, destroying infrastructure, and prohibiting civilians from enjoying their human rights is actually illegal even in wartime, because it has bigger destruction to an economy, to people and people's lives than even warfare. So we need the sanctions on Zimbabwe to be removed.
All right, clearly a very interesting discussion here, but I want to get your final remarks to both of you. And because, you know, there is an agreement, though, that sanctions against Zimbabwe, at least from the both of you, must be removed. Is there room for dialogue domestically and with international partners at this point? What options, Professor Mukonza, does Zimbabwe have as we speak?
I think chances of dialogue from where I'm sitting are very slim, because if we take the internal political players, they are far from each other, at least from what we see in the public domain. They are far from each other. I mean, we can't even talk about bringing in externals, because what I think should happen first is that internal role players themselves should have a common understanding that they need to sit down and agree to, you know, on a common goal, find each other and begin to forge, like what happened with in 2008 with the global political agreement.
Right.
Everyone within the country had seen the need, but I don't see it being present in the current political situation.
Rutendo, you have the final word. I just want to know from you, what recourse does Harare have at this point when it comes to the sanctions?
The recourse that is there is legal action, International Court of Justice, and also undertaking legal action like we are currently doing in South Africa and other jurisdictions against the illegality of these sanctions that has been determined by the UN Human Rights Council, plus a number of other laws that already exist. Because of this duress of sanctions, because of the duress of threats of military invasion, this opposition, the Constitution of Zimbabwe, must be nullified so that we restore democracy in Zimbabwe. So the removal of these criminals from our political system is a starting point and recourse for us as Zimbabweans. And I think you saw how difficult these people are when you wanted to just bring them here to give their side of the story. And they ran away from having an engagement like this because they're not dialogue people. They are people that believe in using the duress of their Western powers in order for them to get what they want. The dialogue in Zimbabwe can be had with other political players. I do not believe that we can have dialogue with the West, because the West needs to continue its parasitic relationship with Africa. And Zimbabwe is a country that has refused hegemony, suzerainty, and this parasitic relationship in which the West want to control our resources and we become slaves. That's never going to happen. So we can never get into an agreement with the West as long as they want to prey on Western countries for them to maintain their high standards of living.
Professor Mukonza and Rutendo, to you both, thank you very much for a lively discussion. But that's all we have time for this week on the program. A big thank you to our panel of experts in Polokwane, Professor Ricky Mukonza, Senior Lecturer in Politics and Public Affairs, Chishiwane University, and in Johannesburg, Rutendo Matinyarare, Marketing Strategist and Anti-Sanctions Campaigner. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation through our social media platforms on Facebook and Twitter. And you can watch this and other editions of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist. Do join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi, until next time, goodbye.